Welcome everyone to tonight's talk, Shark Alert. Are we safe swimming this summer? We're thrilled to have shark experts William McKeever, author and documentary filmmaker of Emperors of the Deep, and Phil Lobel, professor of marine biology at Boston University, who are joining us tonight to talk about all the shark sightings we're seeing this summer and what this means. Climate change is pushing sharks, including great whites, into new waters. Although we had a robust discussion about this earlier as we were preparing for this talk. So I think we're going to have some interesting discussions about perspectives on climate change and what we're seeing with sharks. This summer, we've seen shark sightings off Long Island, Cape Cod, and California beaches, as well as around the world. And just last week, many beaches in the Hamptons were closed due to multiple shark sightings. So why is this happening? Is it due to climate change and warming ocean waters? Is it safe to swim along our beaches? And what's happening to the sharks themselves that we should know about? These are some of the questions we'll be answering tonight. So I hope you're as excited as I am to hear from our experts about the impact of climate change on our ocean ecosystem, and also, and very importantly, some tips to keep you safe in the water. I'm delighted to first introduce Philip Lobel, who is a professor of marine biology at Boston University. Phil received his PhD from Harvard. He applies his knowledge to scientific issues and societal concerns of fisheries management and conservation. His scientific work has focused on field studies of fish behavior and of ecology. Phil has worked in a variety of habitats worldwide, and in recent years, he's applied his scientific expertise to contemporary problems in conservation biology and environmental protection, particularly with sharks. Phil was the chief scientist of the Department of Defense in its Coral Reef program, and he played a major role in the establishment of several marine preserves around the world. And William McKeever is an author and documentary filmmaker and a lover of sharks. His film, Emperors of the Deep, is playing on Microsoft Movies, and his book of the same name is available on Amazon and in bookstores nationwide. Bill advocated in the book for the protection of sharks and makes the argument that sharks are crucial to the health of our oceans. Bill started a nonprofit called Safeguard the Seas, and you'll have links to a number of these organizations that you'll see coming up in the chat. And the organization is devoted to protecting sharks. With 100 million sharks dying every year, he's focused on getting legislation passed to protect sharks, as well as educating the public about the need to preserve these magnificent animals. And I'm Wendy Gerber. I'm CEO of the International Consulting Group, a global strategy and marketing consulting firm, driving triple bottom line business growth, focused on ESG strategy for many of the world's leading corporations. I'm also a global brand strategist working with Siegel and Gale. And I've worked with companies and organizations, including Ralph Lauren, Citigroup, Kenneth Cole, and the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm a member of the board of directors of Conscious Capitalism New York City and the Sustainability and Innovation Committee of the French American Chamber of Commerce. Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, the Princeton Club of New York, as well as our co-sponsor, Conscious Capitalism New York City. Tonight, we'll be chatting for about 50 minutes, and then Bill and Phil will answer questions from you, our audience, for about 15 minutes. So please remember, and you can do this throughout the discussion, click on the Q&A tab and type your questions into the box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So if you're a beach lover, as I am, you're no doubt aware that there have been many shark sightings this summer. I have family in the Hamptons. As I mentioned just last week, beaches were closed due to multiple shark sightings, and an alert went out to residents in Southampton. According to the police there, 1 or 2 sharks about 6 feet in length were feeding on a large school of bait fish close enough to shore to be of concern to swimmers near a town beach. A drone was used to confirm the sighting about 200 to 300 yards offshore. So this is not from exactly the same drone footage, but we thought we would show you what somebody saw off the coast of Long Island in just last month in July. So here's a clip.
And Wendy, let me just jump in here. What you're seeing here is, this is a school of bunker fish. A bunker fish or a bait fish. And you can see the sharks are in the middle of the school going after those bunker fish. And the bunker fish are kind of getting out of the way of the sharks so that they don't end up being a meal. But you can see these schools are huge, covering thousands, millions of fish, and the sharks have come in to feed on the fish. Now, we as humans should just be a little careful that we don't want to get too close to these shoals, because there could be an accident as the shark is going for the bunker fish to run into a person. But these sharks are here hunting in these schools. Nature has provided these shoals of bunker fish. This is what keeps the sharks going. This is the food that they need. And there's plenty of fish to go around, and the sharks are there to take out the diseased fish, the ones that are susceptible, to keep that fish population healthy.
Okay, thanks very much. And we can pause the video now. So I did want to add that Long Island officials a couple of weeks ago reported 26 confirmed shark sightings in the waters off Long Island. So Bill and Phil, why is that happening, and what is the role of climate change? And I look forward to hearing the difference in your perspective. We're going to start with Bill, who'll share with us the role of climate change, and then Phil has a somewhat divergent view, and we'll hear that as well.
Yes, well, sharks are facing a number of stresses today. They're being hunted for their fins, for soup, for their meat. And throwing into this mix of late is that humans have been raising not only the outside air temperature, but also the ocean. Over the last century, there's been over a centigrade increase in water temperature. Now, sharks are sensitive to water temperature, and each species likes a particular temperature in the water. So they have to move to places where they have that right temperature, and that puts a stress on them, because they have to travel greater distances. And a perfect example are black-tip reef sharks. Ordinarily, their range is going from North Carolina in the winter months, in the summer months, down to the Florida Keys in the winter months, where they can get warm water. What's happened is that because that water temperature has been changing, heating up, these black-tip sharks, to get the water, the temperature they need, are now having to come up all the way into the Long Island area during the summer months to get to cooler waters. And then the converse, when they go in the winter south, they don't have to go as far south anymore. So they're not going to the Florida Keys. And this obviously has an impact on the ecosystem, because sharks are crucial to keeping that ecosystem healthy. Again, they help to make sure those fish populations are in good shape. So sharks are moving around. Other species, hammerheads, are ending up in the Celtic Sea, which they've never been recorded going up that far before. So they're moving in all kinds of places. It's changing the ecosystem that we don't fully understand, and it's a great stress for sharks. Now, just to finish the thought, when it comes to humans, the sharks have always been out there. We just have the technology for the first time to see them. We've got the drones now so that we can go out and see them. They've always been there, and hopefully they always will. But the climate change is a stressor for them, and the sharks are out there, and we have to be cognizant that we have to adjust to their schedule, not to ours.
So you don't think that there's necessarily more sharks, it's just that we've got the technology to identify them now?
Well, I think that the technology helps to identify them. So that's why we're getting more sightings. But I would say that for some species, conservation efforts have improved the populations, and most notably it's great whites.
Okay.
Seals were driven almost to extinction. They were brought back with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And as the seals have brought back, the great whites have come back. And now we're seeing them in places like Cape Cod and even closer to where we are. So that is having an impact in helping the populations.
And from our discussion before, I understand seals are like the filet mignon of the shark menu. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. The sharks need the high energy food. They need blubber. Humans, we've got very bony. We don't have that rich material that they are used to getting. So they would much prefer, they're much better off eating seals than us.
Okay, so with that, thank you for that, Bill. Let's move over to you, Phil. I want to hear your perspective on climate change, number of sharks in the waters, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a complicated problem, obviously. I'm a scientist and I could launch into a long lecture, which I'm not going to bore you with. But the short part of the question is the change in climate affecting them? And I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is sharks, as we know them, the species that we see today, have been around for at least 20 million years. The youngest evolved shark group are the hammerheads. And the hammerheads are the most recently derived shark. They're known in the fossil record about 25 million years. Blacktip sharks go back 50 million years or so. So these animals have been around. They've survived many epochs of climate change. Every animal, as Bill says, has their own temperature preference of things. That's certainly a factor. But personally, I don't see climate change as being the driver. Now, there's no doubt that we have changing currents and we have the Gulf Stream that brings warm water in. We have increasing water. Bill is absolutely correct. The animals will follow, good habitat and good water. But we also see migrations when species start to become more abundant. I'm an old guy. I started diving in the Florida Keys in the early 1960s. And I can remember, because my family fished and I was with people that studied sharks. That's how I got into it. There were many more back then. What happened was we went through a period in human history here in the United States from the 60s to the 90s where there was rampant shark fishing in tournaments, as Bill well knows, and we decimated the populations. We drew them to the brink of extinction. And when you do that, you see the animals then focus on their most core areas or where they're least impacted. For the last 30 years, we've been protecting sharks. And certainly since 2000, the last 20 years, shark protection has been pretty good, not great. As we'll talk about, I'm not in favor of shark tournaments and recreational fishing. But when you start to have animals become more abundant, then individuals in those populations start to migrate and look for other habitat. What happened, 200 years ago in Europe when the population became really abundant? They migrated to America. We all migrated to America, right? So there's a balance between animals finding habitat, but also animals becoming really abundant, and therefore individuals going out and looking for new habitat. Sometimes those survive, sometimes they don't. We don't know that factor. If a blacktip shark comes all the way up here, and Bill's absolutely correct, they come up and they are a tropical shark. Great whites, on the other hand, are not a tropical shark. And great whites can swim from the surface where it's very warm down to 2,000 feet with no effective temperature at all. So temperature just doesn't affect the great white. Blacktips are a shallow water, warm water shark. And yes, they tend to want to stay in those preferred waters. When they come up here, we call that expatriated. Many tropical fish also come up. If any of you collect aquarium fish, you know that in Long Island, Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, people collect coral reef tropical fish. But when they come up here and temperature drops, they die. So we don't know if these sharks, which are highly mobile, are coming up, staying, eating, and dying like the blacktips, or are they migrating back? But it's much more complicated than, I think, just climate change. I understand why everyone's focused on climate change as an easy answer, but if anyone's a farmer, you know, it's much more complicated than that.
You also mentioned something interesting about the waters not being as susceptible to climate change, and that's part of the reason that the sharks are one of the oldest beings. Can you explain that?
Well, they're susceptible. I mean, the oceans are, you know, a huge, you know, buffer for temperature change. So, you know, we sense air temperature changes much more quickly than the ocean. The ocean changes very slowly. What will change, and hasn't yet, if they really are, we're concerned about the long-term climate change, would be things like the disruption of the flow of the Gulf Stream current. Now, you know, I'll also throw out that the magnetic poles are supposed to be changing at some point. And if any of you thought, we have no idea what the impact of that's going to be, but we're going to have a shift in the poles. They change every, you know, 100 million years or whatever it is. We're due for that. But we haven't yet really seen, I don't, you know, maybe I haven't really seen a change in the ocean per se as affected by climate change that everyone's talking about.
Although we do have the melting of the glaciers, et cetera. So.
Absolutely. No, all that's happening. You know, climate change is happening. The question before us is, how much is climate change affecting a shark? And certainly, you know, people talk about the great white shark. That's different. That's a different kind of question. You know, if you, you know, you look at something like a moose, I'll just pick another random animal. Moose have 100-degree body. They can survive in frozen temperatures and in the summer, right? So it's how an animal's adapted. Something like the great white is in fact adapted. You know, they're warm-blooded, they're thermal regulating. They can survive extreme temperature changes.
I imagine there's a lot of scientists studying how they're able to do that, because that would be fascinating for man to be able to learn from that.
Yeah, I would just jump in on the climate change issue, that the man is throwing up so much carbon into the atmosphere, and if it wasn't for the oceans pulling and absorbing that carbon, the Earth would be much hotter than it is today. Now, the payoff or the price we have to pay the ocean is that the ocean becomes far more acidic. And with that increase in acidity, you create problems throughout the ocean ecosystem. There are creatures that rely on a certain pH level to grow their shells. And if you, and those are at the bottom of the food chain. If they get disrupted, it affects the food chain going on all the way up to the sharks. And there's some studies out there that are saying that the increase in ocean acidification, which is the oceans has increased acidity by some 25% over the last 100 years, that's interfering with the sensory perceptions of the sharks for their ability to smell. So it's harder for them to find prey. So it's another stress that we're putting on the sharks and throughout the entire ecosystem. We can't keep pumping all this carbon into the atmosphere. It's hurting the oceans.
No, I totally agree with you, Bill. And the corals, actual physical corals, are very susceptible to climate change, and even the slight temperature change and acidity, as you mentioned. I will say, as a scientist that looked at this, whoever has speculated that the acidity is affecting the smell of sharks is making it up. I have not seen a study, you know, and I think someone just made it up because it sounded good. And that's the danger of this kind of business with things that people sort of, you know, I'm a scientist, I want to deal with the data, I want to know what we, you know, the typical thing. And it's too easy to draw sort of correlations and suppositions without really understanding the science. Sharks, for example, and I know you're going to talk about bull sharks. Bull sharks can migrate from the ocean into fresh water. They can, and in fact, they're incredibly adapted. They have fantastic kidneys. So I'll go on record and say, I think that accepting the sensory perception is not correct.
Okay, well, we love having this dialogue and controversy between the two of you. So I do think it would be helpful for our audience to get more of a perspective and a personal one on sharks. So as I mentioned, Bill has written and directed an incredible film called Emperors of the Sea, and he's going to share the trailer with us now. So Bill, can you set it up for us, please?
Sure. So this is a trailer, 2 minutes of the documentary film that I made after I saw a shark tournament in Montauk, and it got me so angry at all these sharks being massacred for a tournament that I went out on this venture and ventured to find out about sharks, and it's culminated in this film.
We are taught to fear sharks from an early age. So I went on a journey to see if this was true, and I wrote a book about it.
I've waited a lifetime for this to go swimming with a gray white.
And what I found out was the opposite. It is the sharks that should fear man. 100 million sharks are irresponsibly killed every year. These majestic emperors of the deep are crucial to the ecosystem, our climate, and even our survival.
Equipment is ready to go, and the sharks are out there waiting for everybody, and I'm waiting to see them. On my whole journey, I've learned that sharks are not dangerous. The odds are incredibly low that something bad can happen. So now I'm going to put it to test and swim out there without a cage.
The movie is available on Microsoft Movies and for rent or to buy, and obviously the book of the same name is already out. And it created in me a real passion to protect sharks. They are a keystone species, and as Phil knows so well, they are the linchpin that holds the marine ecosystems together.
Well, I am in awe of your bravery diving without a cage. And I know you follow the statistics on shark attacks from the International Shark Attack File. So please fill us in on the question that most of us are really interested in hearing. How many people are killed by sharks around the world? How dangerous is this? And in the United States in a year?
Yeah. Well, if you look at our population, which is now over 6 billion people, and you consider that we kill 100 million sharks a year, you would think that the casualty rate from sharks would be substantial. The average 5-year death rate from sharks is 5 deaths a year. Now, in 2020, we had an unusual year. There were 10. Again, sometimes these numbers will move around year to year. And so far in 2021, we're at 6. So we're very close to the average. So very few people are killed by sharks. It's a tiny number.
And in what area are those who are killed? Is it from a particular geographic region?
It's primarily in areas where there's a lot of people, where there's surfing, where there's interaction with sharks from that standpoint. We in the United States have the most shark attacks of any country in the world. And that's because we're a country of some wealth. And so we have people going to both coasts where they're surfing, enjoying the ocean. And whenever you put a lot of people in the ocean, that's where you're going to have the possibility of a contact and create an issue. So we're responsible for about half the attacks in the world. But because we have such good medical care, it's very rare for someone to die in the United States. On average, you have about less than one person death per year. Obviously varies year to year, but the death rate is incredibly low in this country.
So do you have statistics for the people who passed away last year from shark attacks? How many were from the East Coast of the United States and the West Coast?
Yeah, going from memory, there were a couple of people on the East Coast. There was a person in Maine, and then another person in the Cape. Then there was one on the West Coast. Again, when you consider the millions of people going into the ocean, it's an incredibly small number. The number of attacks, a 5-year average, which is a better number to look at, is approximately 55 a year. And that's been true for the last 10, 15 years. However, recently, the number of attacks has been going down. Now in 2020, because of COVID, there were less people going on vacation. So we saw a plummet in the number of attacks. But even in 2019, the number of attacks were going down because a lot of those black-tip reef sharks that are responsible for attacks on surfers in Florida were no longer moving into that surfing area because of the warmer waters. They stopped migrating probably around Jacksonville. They didn't need to go south to get to the warmer waters. So there were less sharks in the water, hence the theory is that there was a reduction in the number of attacks in 2019. So it looks as if the attack numbers are good. And if you hear the media talking about shark attacks are up, they're wrong. Now, I will say this, that if you go decade to decade, going back to 1900, the number of attacks are up, but that's just a function of the fact that the human population has grown dramatically. And now there are more people in the water. There's more of a potential for an encounter with a shark. But in terms of sharks hunting us, we are not on their menu. They are hunting prey items for their particular species.
So are the sharks turning to people because there's not enough food left for them due to overfishing?
My belief is no, that is not true. They are out there making a living. They have been around for, actually some species of sharks can trace back to 450 million years. As a species, we have been around for as short as 100,000 years. So we haven't been able to get into their DNA as a prey item. And again, we're land animals. We don't have the blubber that they're interested in, although that may vary depending on the person. We're just not the kind of material that they want. It's the seals, it's dolphins, those animals that have rich reserves that they need so much for their survival.
So Bill, are sharks actually coming closer to the shore now than in the past?
I don't believe they are, Wendy. And I have a clip here showing a bull shark coming up to the water. These sharks are constantly on the move. Many species travel up to 100 miles a day. And so they will actually get into these very shallow waters where their noses are practically touching in the sand. And so they're ranging from right up to the beach all the way out, quite a ways out at sea. And this is their normal pattern. This is what they've done for millions of years. So I think it wouldn't be fair to say that sharks are more out to get us. It's more that they're more of us in the water, and because we're encountering them, that we're having these untoward effects.
And the shark that you just showed us, perilously close to the beach, is that on the East Coast? Where was that footage taken?
That was a picture that was taken in the Bahamas. So,
and are those sharks in our waters around New York and the East Coast? Those particular type that go very close to the shore?
Yeah, well, that was a bull shark, and bull sharks like warmer water, so they're usually not around here. I wouldn't count it out. It's anything is possible. Most of those bull sharks are down around Florida, and so if I was in Floridian waters, it would be possible to have an encounter with a bull shark. I've been swimming with bull sharks in Florida, a few miles out at sea, and you know when they can see you and know who you are, and we are feeding them as a way to show them we are friends. That I wasn't particularly worried about that. So encounters of that kind are okay. But again, if you're bathing and stumble into a bull shark, it would be unusual, but you never know what might happen.
Okay, so let's get to the question of the evening. How do you both feel swimming in the ocean? Should the increase in shark sightings make us concerned about swimming or surfing in the ocean? How worried should we be when we go swimming? Phil, let's start with you, and then Phil, I really want to hear your thoughts as well.
Exactly.
Okay, yes. So I think that was a Bill. We got a
Okay,
Bill and a
okay.
Phil. So I would say that when I go swimming, I am respectful. I am entering a wilderness area, and sharks are the top predators, and I respect them. I don't fear them. I'm not going to do something stupid, and some people pull their tails and splash and do silly things. So when I'm in the water, I do feel safe. Now, if I were to swim beyond where the waves are breaking farther out at sea and the water was murky and it was a cloudy day, I might not feel as comfortable at that. But in terms of being just along the shoreline where the waves are breaking, I feel totally safe.
Okay, thank you. Phil, how about you?
Well, feeling, that's a sort of a ethereal thing. I'm very cautious. I think that you got to sort of look at it. I want to come back to one point. Bill was talking about the big sharks that eat blubber and eat seals. That's really the great whites and sometimes the bull shark. Blacktip sharks feed on little fish, and their feeding behavior is to go in, bite the fish in half, and then come around and eat the pieces. Blacktip sharks are responsible for a lot of attacks on people because they're in shallow water feeding on fish, and they take bites, but they don't usually go after a whole person. Something struggles, they back off. They're used to taking little fish and chomping them. Bull sharks are the most dangerous shark in the ocean. Most of us scientists that work in the tropics are very concerned about bull sharks. And if you remember back to the book Jaws, the actual history of the shark attack that inspired that book was actually based on what they think was a bull shark attack up in New York, because it happened inside a riverine area, not a great white. Bull sharks have been heavily fished. Great whites have been heavily fished, but both those sharks are dangerous because they're so large. Bull sharks eat sea turtles. They come up, they crunch a sea turtle. So they have much more impact when they even bite and make a mistake. And Bill's absolutely right. They prefer to eat meaty seal. But with all animals, it's a question of motivation. How hungry are they? And, we kind of go back to when you look at Bill diving with the reef sharks at Stewart's Cove. Those sharks aren't motivated. They're being fed. They're habituated to people. They're swimming around so you could have that tourist experience. In the old days, when scuba diving was first invented, and I was a young student at the time, diving with professors as we were exploring the Pacific Islands, often the very first divers to ever dove these islands, we had lots of shark attacks. The sharks were really curious. The gray reef sharks came in, and we had something called the powerhead to defend ourselves. That changed over time, but I think you've got to look at it from an animal behavior perspective, habituation and motivation. There's certainly a lot of attacks are based on mistaken identity, murky water, things moving around, and on the size of the shark. Blacktips certainly do a lot of biting, and there's been a lot of papers written on that for years. But the great whites, the bull sharks, those two are dangerous. So personally, I would not be swimming where these things are being seen. So we saw a great mass of these things in Cape Cod now. And absolutely, it's a concern. People are not in the water and we're not diving in those areas.
You're not swimming in the ocean right now.
You know, you got to know where, as Bill says, you got to be smart. You got to know where to swim. But yeah, you don't want to swim in somebody's feeding pool. So if there's certain areas, so I'm not swimming off of Chatham, Cape Cod. That's absolutely true. You know, but I'll swim off of Stony Beach and Woods Hole.
Okay, well, I know one of you mentioned, I think it was you, Bill, that you're okay as long as you're within the wave breaks. I think, Phil, you feel differently, that the sharks can come all the way in, but I love the ocean and I love swimming where the water's calm, just past the wave breaks. Is that one of the dangerous spots? What are the worst spots that we can identify to swim?
That's a dangerous spot up here. I mean, up in New England, we have an abundance of great whites coming back into existence. And we certainly have more bull sharks and those two things. So as those numbers and sightings are increasing, it's an issue. If I go back 30 years diving in these same areas, we never saw great whites. They were so rare that we couldn't even find them when we went out and tried to bait for them. So it is a difference of abundance. And, you know, what's happened is it's changed. Whereas before we could dive and surf all these areas, today, you know, it'd certainly be too risky. It becomes a management problem. You know, we've been too successful in protecting the seals and we've been very successful in protecting the sharks. Now they become abundant. What does society do and how do we manage that interaction? That's the same kind of.
Yeah, let me just jump in. I think we've got a couple of regions that are very different. As Phil's saying, these great whites are back in Cape Cod, and I would agree. If I was in Chatham, I'd be up to my waist, and that would be about as far as I would go. But when you're in Long Island, there are great whites are very unusual. I don't think they've even been seen here because there are no seals. Now, there may be an exception of it being a seal, but there's not enough to bring in a lot of great whites. There are three species that are responsible for about 90% of attacks, and that's the great white, the tiger, and the bull shark. Those sharks are not abundant off of Long Island and New Jersey. Blue sharks are way out at sea. They're very timid. So I think where we are in this area of New York, New Jersey, that it is safe. And could you go a little bit beyond the waves? I think that's okay. I wouldn't go venture too far, but certainly inside where the waves are breaking, because the sharks don't want to get caught in those waves. They can get stranded. They can get pushed up on the beach. Could be dangerous for them. So I think as long as you're in the waves and the churn, that in this area, for my money, I feel very safe.
My daughter's a surfer. What about surfing and the fact that, you know, they wear black wetsuits and could resemble a seal? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'll jump in first and then I'll let Phil pile in too. If you look at the International Shark Attack file, over 60% of attacks involve surfers. And the reason is that surfers look like a prey item. If you're a shark looking up, it looks like a turtle or a porpoise. That surfer is making a lot of noise, splashing. That's also going to get the attention of a shark. So surfing is a more dangerous activity in the ocean, just looking at the statistics. So you don't want to splash around. Again, in the Northeast here in New Jersey and New York, they're not the big tiger sharks that you get, say, in Hawaii that can do some serious damage. So I think it's safe to go surfing from that standpoint. Actually, I was just out swimming today in the ocean. We have lots of surfers out there. I see them every day out there. And if the sharks were really interested, it would be a bloodbath out there. There are millions of people surfing.
Which beach?
And yet we have these very few incidents.
Where were you at today, Bill?
I was at the Bridgehampton Beach in Long Island.
Okay. So Phil, what about you? What are your thoughts about surfing?
No, I think Bill summed it up correctly. I mean, you've got to be aware of where you are. The surfing, there's been lots of videos and documentaries to show how the surfer looks like a seal or a turtle at the surface. And many of these sharks see a silhouette, they attack from the bottom, and they come up like that. I think you've got to look at the environment you're in. It's the same thing like going hiking and asking, are there bears, right? And again, the chances of an attack are very low, as Bill pointed out, but it's the motivation of the individual animal. So I think people should be aware, and I think you got to, not swim where sharks are being seen. Although the seals are up here in New England, in Cape Cod, the sharks are migrating up and down the coast, and we're certainly seeing that from some of the tracking data. It is a question of how frequently they're feeding. So the other corollary is we don't know a lot about the biology of these animals. You would think that science would know a lot more about great white sharks, their physiology, and other things, but we don't. There's a lot of film about these things, but not a lot of science gets funded to actually study sensory perception variation with acidity and things of that sort. So as a scientist, it's somewhat frustrating because there's a lot of thinking and people imagining what's going on, but not critical experiments trying to determine exactly how the animal is behaving. How does a shark think? What's it motivating? All things of that sort.
I'm curious about one other thing. Recently, when my youngest daughter was surfing in the far Rockaway Beach, a fin appeared in the water. It wasn't a shark, it was a school of dolphins. And it was really amazing to watch them play. But does that mean that since dolphins were there, that sharks were actually nearby?
No, there's not necessarily a correlation, but I would say if dolphins could be there, sharks could also be there.
Okay. And Bill, you mentioned that there are shark deterrent wetsuits. Can you tell us a bit about that and where we can find them?
Yeah, so people have come up with some ideas to protect themselves. So one is a swimsuit that has a pattern that makes them look like a sea snake. And all sea snakes are poisonous, and sharks, of course, know that. So the sweatsuits have been designed with alternating bands of black and white. And so that would be a deterrent to a shark. Those are available online. And right now, we've been trying since World War II to figure out some way to deter sharks. And nothing has really been very effective. That's one idea that's been bantied about. And right now, there are very few options that are available.
Bill, could you share the link to that wetsuit so we can share it with our audience when we send our follow-up email?
Yes, I will get that for you.
Terrific. So another thing that I wanted to explore with you is, does tagging sharks help us understand them better and also see where they are? Phil, could you chat about this?
I kind of want to jump in just 1 second on the wetsuit thing, since we talked about it. I think it's complete bullshit. And, there's stuff being marketed. The sea snake hypothesis was developed by John Randall, one of the most famous ichthyologists, and he developed it back in the 1960s. And we tried a whole bunch of different things of that. First of all, any shark in the Atlantic Ocean will have no familiarity with a sea snake. It's not going to affect. In the Pacific, sharks eat sea snakes. It was an idea that came up. I could show you pictures of me with Jack Randall. I had giant eye spots on my wetsuit so I could go like this to make myself look bigger, which is what stomatopods and other animals. We tried a whole bunch of that stuff. none of it was effective when the animal was motivated. And we've tried the electric devices. There is one thing that seems effective, developed during World War II. And if many of you remember Julia Child, the famous chef, before she was a famous chef, she worked for the OSS and was actually working with the Harvard scientists who developed the anti-shark repellents based on the Moses sole discovered by Eugenie Clark, which is soap. So soap seems to not, seems to repel sharks. So people have used different soapy type things. But
so what do? You go diving or surfing and you carry a couple of soap bars with you? How does that work?
Something like that. Well, that's it. It's not, the delivery is not practical. So the Navy used these with something called a shark shield. They had a bag of dye. When a pilot went into the water, they would release this dye that had this soap-like material in it. And hopefully the pilot would stay in it and the other sharks would just sort of cover up, maybe it would cover up our smell or something of that sort. But that was the strategy.
So you carry a bottle of soap detergent and squirt it out as you're surfing?
Potentially. I mean, obviously it doesn't work, and none of these things.
All right, so let's get into the tagging. I know you're an expert on this, Phil. Is that a good thing, both to learn about sharks and also monitor where they are?
Well, tagging is absolutely a valuable tool. The issue with tagging sharks is the method of tagging. And Bill and I have talked about this extensively. I did have a video, but I guess I can't really share it on the screen. But what's happening today is that people have underestimated the shark as a living animal. And if you've watched some of these videos, they capture these great whites and they take these satellite tags, which are fairly large, and drill holes through the dorsal fin of the shark to bolt this tag on. That's not good. That affects the animal. There's other types of tags that are non-invasive, like a bracelet. So, tags take on a variety of different morphologies. And Bill and I are working on this intensely. I think it's a major problem because tagging and tracking is absolutely the right way to go. It's how we learn about the animals. But in science today, we're just perfecting the technologies. And part of that technology that has to be perfected is how to attach it to the animal so that it doesn't hurt the animal and it doesn't affect the animal's behavior. Now, I will tell you as a scientist, I'm fairly caustic to people who have no sensitivity to animals. And they think that, bolting, drilling a hole in the fin of the shark is the same. They think it's the same as putting an earring in the lobe of our ear. It's not. It's more like putting a bolt through the hand because the fin is used. It's full of muscles and tendons. And it's used for the animal to glide through the water. It's not a static, solid, immovable piece.
But I must say, I'm having a little difficulty conceptualizing where a bracelet would go on a shark.
It goes on the caudal peduncle. So first of all, are you seeing this? I don't know what's.
Yes.
Do you see this graphic?
Yes.
So this is showing how they're bolting a tag to a dorsal fin. You can see the drill, right? Are you seeing this? The drill going through, they're putting it on. There's another way where they spear the shark. I'm going to go right to this one. Here's how they bolt it on, or this is putting it in the stomach.
Oh boy.
Now, let me see, how do I stop sharing the screen? Oh, stop share, and then go to one other one.
Oh, you've got another one. Okay.
All right, last one. Here's the bracelet tag. This is one of my sharks. Here you can see the bracelet, and it's attached to what's called the caudal peduncle. It's attached with just a simple, bracelet, and it comes off when the tag's not good anymore. So it's more like wearing a bracelet on your hand.
Now, you just called that shark one of my sharks. Are there particular sharks that you're entrusted to monitor and watch?
There are sharks that I've studied, certain sharks like that, that was in Palau in South Pacific that I studied for 10 years and tracked and went back and tracked them and looked at them for a long period of time.
Okay, so we do have one audience question. We were talking about Long Island and Cape Cod, and we had a question from the audience as to what's happening off the coast of Maine in terms of sharks right now, if you can speak to that.
Phil, that's maybe a little closer to your area.
Yeah, so I've heard they have recently caught a couple of the great whites up in Maine. I know the one of the research boats that tags the great whites off of Cape Cod, they're up there, but I haven't heard of any incidents per se. You know, okay. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think they're up there.
So Bill, let's take another tack here. Should we care about sharks if we lose them? Can you both fill us in about that?
Absolutely. As science has begun to understand about predators, we realize that there are some species that are a keystone. In other words, all the other creatures in that ecosystem rely on that predator to help to maintain the system by making sure that there's no one species that monopolizes resources. On land, a perfect example is in Yellowstone, the wolves. They took the wolves out and it was utter mayhem. And they brought the wolves back. And when they did, they said that the rivers actually flowed straighter and other species came back. And in the ocean, the counterpart to the wolves are the sharks. They're the keystone species. So give you a perfect example, it's in my film and in the book. There was a wonderful study that was done off of Australia in seagrass systems. Now, seagrass is a great way to store carbon because it sucks in all that carbon and the seagrass grows. The grazers, the sea turtles and the dugongs, given their druthers, they would wipe out the seagrass. But when tiger sharks are around, they have to worry about being eaten by the tiger sharks. So these grazers are just nipping away at the seagrass. So when the tiger sharks are in abundance, you find these lush salad bowls of greenery that help to maintain the seagrass beds, which are perfect place for little fish to hide and grow up and help the overall ecosystem. And that's just one example of how crucial sharks are. And in virtually every ecosystem out there in the ocean, whether it's the open ocean, pelagic, sharks play that very important role of protecting the ecosystem. We have to protect sharks.
Okay, Bill, I want to hear from you, but I also want to remind our audience, please remember to click on the Q&A and put your questions there. And so Bill and Phil can answer your specific questions. Okay, so on to you, Phil, for that issue.
No, I think Bill said it right. I mean, you know, they're important to the ecosystem. They're important for aesthetics. You know, will the world survive without sharks? Of course it will. It would be just completely different, just like the wolves when they're removed. We don't want to do that. I think our value is we love the natural world. If you don't love the natural world, you probably don't care. But for the most part, we don't know enough about the world's ecosystems to be making the decisions of which species to remove. We're already seeing huge problems with monoculture of agriculture, outbreaks of diseases, you know, so it's not how the world evolved. So I agree completely with what Bill is saying. We shouldn't mess with systems that we don't understand, and it's better to leave these as part of the natural system.
Now, I know you both talked about wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone, and yet there's a big controversy right now with a number of people feeling like they should be on the endangered species list, which they're not. So obviously that's a critical way to conserve and protect a species. Are sharks on the endangered species list?
Well, remember, there's 500 different species of sharks, so it depends which ones you're talking about.
Okay.
You know, the great white shark has been on the endangered species list. I don't know where it stands right now. There's certain sharks, you know, that are in Philippines and others that have very small distribution. So remember, there's just too, it's like talking about birds. There's just
Right.
too many different ones. But there are certain sharks that are on the endangered species list, have gotten on and off of them at different times. The Endangered Species Act is the most powerful act we have for protecting species. But on the other part, at one point, when the populations rebound and we have an abundance like the seals and the great whites now in Cape Cod, then society's faced with a management issue. It's not a science issue, it's a management issue. And how do you manage people interacting with dangerous wildlife? Just like bears, right? You know, you have nuisance bears coming into people's backyard, they got to move them. So society and growth is not compatible with nature. We know that. And the challenge we have is how to balance the two together.
And you're also not a fan of shark hunting.
The what?
You are not a fan of shark hunting to minimize.
No,
correct.
no, absolutely not. I think the tournaments are ridiculous. You know, they're just a blood sport. I don't believe in killing anything for fun. I'm a hunter. I've hunted. I collect fish. Believe me, I've killed more sharks than many other scientists have before, you know, especially, you know, in the last century. But no, I don't think we should be out there recreationally fishing. I think these tournaments that just show the dead animals that they cut for the jaws or just for the is ridiculous. On the other hand, if you're dealing, you know, right now in Cape Cod, they are dealing with a serious issue. It's affecting the tourist economy. Like you said, everyone wants to go swimming. More people are upset about the seals because the seals are taking the prime beach spots, you know, where you set your cabanas and your chairs. They're taking those spots and then they bring it in the sharks. So that becomes a social pressure. So people right now arguing to bring back shark tournaments into Cape Cod as a way to control the sharks. That's how it started. You know, in Hawaii in 1956, a surfer was killed, Billy Weaver, and that started the Hawaiian shark fishing program because Hawaii tourism was building up and Hawaii said, we have to get rid of sharks. And so they went out and wiped out, you know, it doesn't take long to catch all the tigers and these bigger sharks, but it takes many decades for the populations to rebound.
So I want to get to some of our audience questions. We have one question, which is, what is the best way that we as individuals can help protect sharks? Bill, I know this is a question close to your heart, so.
Yeah, and I think if you look at where the most of the death of 100 million sharks takes place, it's out in the Pacific Ocean, where you have Asian fishing fleets that are hunting for tuna. And so when you buy canned tuna, that probably came from the Pacific Ocean, and they were hunting for tuna, but they were also catching sharks. Now, when they're hunting for tuna, they could let the sharks go, but they don't, because they know when they fin the sharks, they can sell the fins to the Chinese and other Asian countries. And to me, it's a cultural habit that needs to be broken. I don't think societies can hide behind the banner of, well, it's our culture. We have to look at the big picture for the oceans and for all of humankind. So when you're in the supermarket, think twice about buying canned tuna. Now, if you must eat canned tuna, which is fine, buy pole caught canned tuna, which is tuna that's been caught with one fisherman with one pole. And it will say on the label, pole caught tuna. So you can make a very important impact. And also think about the fish, the other fish that you're buying. Make sure that it's sustainable. There are organizations out there that rate fish as far as their abundance and ability to be harvested, and get to know about those things. And when you go into a restaurant, ask where the fish came from. They have that information. It's out there. and make them provide it so that you, as an informed consumer, can make smart decisions to save sharks and protect the oceans, and ultimately to have enough food for yourself and your future generations.
Okay, thank you. We have another audience question that I'm going to direct to Phil, which is, if I am determined to swim off the Atlantic coast of Nantucket, what can I do to minimize my risk?
I think go out on a very calm, clear day when there's not a lot of surf and the water's very calm, the sediments settle down, you have much greater visibility. It would be a lot safer. I got to come back to, I just got to mention something about the tuna. If you read the cans of tuna, the levels of mercury are really high. And they tell you not to eat more than 2 cans a week. I teach this in my ichthyology class. You know, so there's a good reason for us not to be eating tuna in addition to protecting the sharks. It's unfortunately been highly polluted. It's the same with shark tissue. Sharks have very high concentrations of mercury. It's not something we should, even the fin tuna, I mean, the fin sharks in China have very high levels of mercury. So
let me add, I agree with Phil. Those are good points. I just want to mention, again, here in the Northeast, they are catching mako sharks in shark tournaments. Mako sharks are an endangered species. That, to me, is reprehensible that that's allowed. Number 2 is Citarella sells shark meat in their Manhattan store. I think they do it in other places as well. And to me, that's also equally as bad. One, they're selling a product, as Phil, I agree 100%. It's loaded with mercury, and it's an endangered species. It's like as if I went to the butcher shop and I said, give me 5 pounds of lion meat, please. That's something that just, as a culture, we need to understand more about what's going on out in the oceans and make these decisions that are better for the environment.
So we have one question. Somebody's drawing an analogy between, we discussed a number of animals tonight, but one of which we just talked about wolves and we talked about sharks. And I'm not sure how conversant you are in French, but they asked if the name of the shark in French is loup de mer, because loup means wolf in French. Any idea of the answer to that one? Okay, I don't think we have any more questions, so I think you've done an amazing job answering people's questions. And what I'll say is in our follow-up email, as I mentioned, there'll be resources, groups to contact for information and resources about sharks. I know that Bill is very active in driving advocacy for legislation to protect sharks. So Phil and Bill will be sharing content with you, and the Princeton Club will follow up on that. So I really want to thank you, Bill and Phil, for joining us tonight to share your expertise and your insights about sharks, and also to share tips about how we can safely enjoy the rest of our summer. We hope it's allayed some concerns among audience members, although I know it might have raised some concerns among others, and also, very importantly, raising awareness about the important role that sharks play in our ecosystem. Thank you also to the Princeton Club of New York and Conscious Capitalism New York City for co-sponsoring tonight's program. And a big thank you to all of you who joined us this evening. So the Princeton Club is recording this talk, and we will be sending everyone the link, and also sharing how you can watch Bill's film, Emperor of the Sea, as well as purchasing his book. And we have many other terrific programs planned. We hope you'll join us. So thank you again, Bill and Phil, for your time and your tremendous insights. And thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us tonight.
All right, thank you, everyone. And we'll see you at the beach and in your bathing suit.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.